Hello and welcome again. If you joined us on our last episode, you'll recognize this layout as an episode of Deck Deconstructed, our series where we break down cool deck concepts from TCGs. And so far, we've focused on Magic the Gathering, but I also want to get some Flesh and Blood and some other card games in this series, maybe even cover some dead card games. Things that you don't see anymore because they are no longer in print. But today, we're sticking to the classics. And as classic as you can get with Magic the Gathering, we're playing a mono-white deck with lifegain. My goodness. This particular deck, though, has some pretty gnarly options to it. Playing my online version in MTG Arena, I kid you not, there are people that when they start to see the combos from this deck, I'm not the only one who plays them, there are people that when they see the combos to this deck just straight quit, because they know that they are not equipped to handle what's coming. And it seems like it's an overpowered deck until you actually learn its counters. The spells and things that can take this deck down are actually pretty easy to get out on the board, and they will completely shut this deck down. So we'll cover those as well as the cards in the deck, because it is important to know what to do in those situations and what to focus on. I don't own the majority of those cards, so I cannot show them to you. There's some pretty spendy and powerful Magic the Gathering cards because they are as effective at shutting down this particular strategy of life gain. So, one of them is Sanguine Bond. There was another card that has the similar function that has a different name. It came out in the recent Innistrad block. I will have to find the name of that and put it in the description. But this deck depends on life gain generating counters, +1/+1 counters onto your creatures, and just turning into this massive engine of destruction. So even a 1/1 creature that comes onto the board at the right point in the game ends up becoming this behemoth 10/10 creature that your opponent will have difficulty stopping. So as this engine ramps up, it gets scarier and scarier, and your opponent has less and less opportunity to do anything about it. And you know, it's fun to play this deck where you see your life total just skyrocketing through the roof, and you see your creature's power and toughness just growing and growing with every card you play. I'm going to hit the land base first. And with this one, the only non-basic land I've got in the deck currently is Radiant Fountain, which just adds, it gives you 2 life when it comes onto the battlefield. So this you would save until later in the game. You wouldn't use it your first couple of turns. You'd wait until you had your engine out. And then you drop one of these to cause an additional trigger and to cause more +1/+1 counters to be put on all of your creatures and make them stronger. One of the things that I would like, or I'm considering switching out and including in this, are some of the flip lands from Zendikar, where they come in into play as white lands, or they have additional effects. Problem is there are better ones that exist for this deck. I haven't ever gotten any of them in physical, because like something like creatures you control get +2/+2 till end of turn. With this deck for 5 mana, that's useless. I mean, that's just not even a thing. This is a useful one that I am going to include. Kabira Takedown deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker. This works as kind of an interesting sideways removal. And it only costs 2. So once this thing gets going and you have these creatures that have like 30 or 40 power and toughness, there's just about nothing your opponent can have on the board that when this is thrown at it, it won't die immediately. So I'm putting in the Kabira Takedown. I'm just going to pop out a regular land here for it. But this one's not a necessary card, my word. So if you don't have something like this, don't worry about it too much. It doesn't affect the rest of this. It's just a quick one-off. And as you can see, we've got nothing but basic lands, so we have some room to play with this. I'm just going to pop out one of these beautiful, gorgeous full art lands. Because this deck has been such a fun one to play. I splurged and pulled out of my collection all the different full art lands I've collected. And then for the combo, the generator engine in this deck, that I call it, there are 3 different parts, and I'm going to give them each a name. We've got our generators, which generate life. This is kind of a weird spot because some of our generators are also our amplifiers. And then we have receivers. So our generators create life, our amplifiers amplify that life gain, and then our receivers receive these +1/+1 tokens that are being counters that are being generated by these amplifiers. So our generators, sorry, let me flip this real quick. Generators are simple. It's the Rock's Faithmender. So this is kind of a classic card from back in M13. It's really basic. You drop for 4 a 1/5 creature that has lifelink. But the reason he gets crazy out of control is if you would gain life, you gain twice that much life instead. So if you put down a bunch of Rock's Faithmenders, this one doubles your life, this one quadruples it, this one it's times 8. So for every 1 life you gain, if you had these 3 down on the board, you would be gaining 8 life. Every time. And it just goes uphill from there. It just gets insane. Rock's Faithmender usually will get targeted and immediately eliminated, which is why we have things like Apostle's Blessing. Target artifact creature you control gains protection from artifacts or from the color of your choice until end of turn. So you play this, target him, say, nuh-uh, this does not get this color, or can't be touched by this color, he's safe. Real quick and easy way to save your creature from being completely and utterly obliterated, because people will do that to the Rock's Faithmender. Now, to get into the real meat and potatoes of this deck, if I can pick that card up, we have our amplifiers. I'll cover some of the easiest one first. We've got Pride Guardian. He's for 1, a 0/3 defender with, when he blocks, you gain 3 life. He's not a terribly powerful card, so most people will ignore this one in the beginning. It's a mistake, because that 3 life with the Rock's Faithmenders would mean that every time you're getting hit, you would be getting 24 life. Which comes into play with other cards that makes him generate a lot of dangerous stuff, and you get to block. Authority of the Consuls slows down your opponent. This is probably the most expensive card in this deck. So, Authority of the Consuls, creatures your opponent control enters the battlefield tapped. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. So this card takes your opponent's creatures and plugs them into your engine. So every time your opponent plays something, they're getting punished. We've got Impassioned Orator. When another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So every creature you play down, more life. Core Celebrant, which I've got 4 copies in here because he's a bit more durable. As you can see, he's a 1/4. So a lot less prone to removal from your opponent if they're playing red or if they're playing green. Whenever Core Celebrant or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. You see where this is going? So, Lunarch Veteran, same thing. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life. This one's interesting too, because if your opponent kills it, he's only a 1/1 for 1. But if they kill it, you can flip it, and then it becomes a Flying Spirit Cleric that whenever a creature leaves the battlefield, you gain 1 life. So then if your opponent starts to kill things off, you can use him to still generate for your engine. And then the real star of this deck, and the one that causes everybody to panic and freak out, is the Soul Warden. Soul Warden generates 1 life whenever a creature comes onto the battlefield, yours or your opponent's. So with the combo of Soul Warden and Authority of the Consuls, just as far as this deck's setup is, the one I've got I'm showing you, with just these 5 cards, you end up generating 5 life gain triggers every creature your opponent puts down. So if your opponent is playing a token deck, things get out of hand fast. I had a match where we actually crashed the client for MTG Arena, and it started doing all sorts of weird stuff that it's not supposed to do, like adding weird things to creatures, removing creatures from stuff. It started glitching out weird because we entered into an infinite combo where my opponent kept generating creatures, I kept generating life gain and +1/+1 counters, and that action then triggered him to create more creatures, which just, it went down a rabbit hole that was insane. It was a squirrel generator deck I was fighting, and I'll never do that again. And then kind of a multi-purpose tool in this deck is the Cleric class, because this is a generator, it's an amplifier, and it's a hat trick for pulling creatures that your opponent has annihilated back from the dead. So you have 4 shots in this deck. 1, 2, 3, 4 copies of Cleric class. When you move it to level 3, you get to pull 1 creature out of your graveyard, which is usually a black ability, not a white, so it's really powerful to have it in this set of cards. You pull that creature right back out and pop it down, so even if your opponent goes and kills creatures, they're still adding into your engine because you get additional triggers of playing your creatures and generating more life and more counters. It's not in this deck because I don't own the physical copies of the card, but another thing that you can add to help with this generator is a Johnny's Welcome, which is why the deck that I posted on our Patreon, if you go and check out there, I have the MTG Arena version of this deck posted as a deck listing for our patrons. That one contains a Johnny's Welcome as well. I've taken some other things out to add that in, and because some of these cards are not available in MTG Arena, at least not to my knowledge, the Johnny's Welcome works in there as well. And then we have all of our receiver cards. So first we're going to point out the elephant in the room, which is the Ozolith. If I can get that to focus. Come on. Show the Ozolith. There we go. This card fetches quite a bit. Actually, this might be the most expensive card in this deck. The Ozolith. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. So these counters that we generate don't go away. This guy will also be the target of removal hate. And then the real attack star of this deck is 4 copies of Voice of the Blessed. Now, Voice of the Blessed is a fantastic rare from Crimson Vow. And what it does is, whenever you gain life, it gains a +1/+1 counter. If it has 4 +1/+1 counters on it, it gains flying and vigilance. So then it's an aggressive attacker and a blocker. And then if you can get it up to 10 +1/+1 counters, so making it a 12/12 creature, it gains indestructible. So he becomes very durable. And if this deck gets its triggers off right, he's very durable, very fast. So Voice of the Blessed is an absolute include in this deck. You want 4 copies of it if you can get your hands on it. It's not too terrible right now on Card Kingdom or TCG Player. They're about $3, $4 a piece, so as much as it would cost you to buy a pack to try and get him, and then you're guaranteed to get him. The other card that I absolutely always include in this deck is a Johnny's Pridemane, which is Spirit Clerk, Voice of the Blessed Light. Its only ability is whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on a Johnny's Pridemate. Same cost in mana in a monocolored deck. A little bit easier to get your hands on collection-wise. And then, as a fun toss-in for late game, I run the Sarah Avatar as one of the creatures in this deck as well. Sarah's Avatar gets ugly in this deck because its power and toughness are equal to your life total. And your life total in this deck can very easily exceed 200. So then you just have this massive creature that your opponent can never do anything about. And when you get something like that out on the board, to talk about another combo that this has, you can use something like Apostle's Blessing to make Sarah's Avatar unblockable if your opponent's playing creatures that are all of the same color. And sometimes this even works with dual-colored decks, because a lot of the dual-colored decks these days, all of the creatures are both colors, so red or white. So it doesn't matter which color you declare on those creatures, declaring it will make it so that it can't be blocked by, even just one color will make it so they can't be blocked by anything. The reason I like Apostle's Blessing is because unlike most of these cards that grant protection from a color, Apostle's Blessing also gives you protection from artifact. So this card is an absolute must if you can. If you can't, Sajiri's... Oh, I can't remember the name of it. But there's another card. It's one of the Zendikar dual spell lands. Sajiri's... I can't remember. Sajiri's Safety? Something like that. Also gives protection, but it's only from colored. You can't get protection from artifact at all. Now, with all of those, we have other cards to facilitate getting things into our hand faster and creating life triggers. So we have Revitalize, which is a great one because for 2 mana, you gain 3 life and you draw a card. So these guys generate those life gain triggers. If you have some of the cleric class and even one Rock's Faith Mender, you're generating like 6 or 8 life just by dropping this, or more. I mean, you could end up generating 12 life with this card, no problem. We also have Pressure Point, which, while it allows you to draw a card, also allows you to control the board. It can help you get those big creatures through and attacking, since trample isn't really a thing in white. So we have those two. That's another copy of Apostle's Blessing. Or no, that is the one copy. There we go. Apostle's Blessing is hard to get your hands on because it's from New Phyrexia, which is a very popular and expensive set. I have more somewhere, I just haven't found them yet. And for the last element to this deck, we have removal, because the one major weakness to this deck is if people start tampering with your engine. So, for small things that get in your way, we have Portable Hole. So, you can target a non-land permanent with a mana value of 2 or less for real cheap. That's great removal. Oblivion Ring does same thing for higher cost, but it's any non-land permanent. Take those out real easy. And then you have True Love's Kiss, which for 1 mana more than Oblivion Ring just exiles it. But it's only artifacts or enchantments. It also works as card draw. So, it can also go in this pile here. What's really great about this card is the best way to handle this deck's nemesis, which is the Sanguine Bond or something like the Vorninklex that stops you from generating your +1/+1 tokens or stops you from generating life gain. Anything that stops you from gaining life or from gaining counters needs to be eliminated immediately. This deck will be completely shut down. So if you see something, like I said, the Vorninklex from Dominaria United, or Sanguine Bond, where when you gain life you would lose that much life instead, you immediately destroy it with this card. And that's honestly just the best way to handle that situation. Now, if your engine does not get started, and you're struggling to get things out on the board because your opponent's removal is really strong and they're hitting you hard, and they're sacrificing the ability to put down creatures just to remove your stuff, so you're both in a stalemate, and then suddenly they start putting things down and you haven't been able to generate your engine, your last ditch resort is something like Doomscar. There's a lot of white cards like this that just eliminate all creatures. Any of them will do. I like Doomscar because you can put Doomscar away somewhere where your opponent can't touch it. So, if you foretell Doomscar, you can tuck it into the exile zone and hold it there and pay 2 less mana than its full mana cost to drop this later, which makes it so much more useful because then you can, like I said, put it out somewhere where your opponent can't touch it at all. It sits there and waiting, and then when you need it, because say something like your opponent is playing the same deck and uses something like Doomscar to eliminate your creatures, you can turn around and drop this from the exile zone, or you can turn around and drop it from exile to completely wipe the board and get back to generating your engine. So that's the quick and the dirty of it. There are a lot of different permutations to this deck. There are some white-black combos and some white-green combos. The name is Successful Innkeeper? Fortuitous Innkeeper. There's a green card that does the same life gain generation when creatures come onto the battlefield, but he also generates treasure tokens. He works really well with this. There are a lot of different cards in black that, when put into this deck, make it even more dangerous with all the life gain you get. And they can also generate life themselves while doing damage to your opponent. So whenever you gain, or your opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life. There's an infinite damage combo that can be done in the white and black version, where if you put down the right combination of black cards, whenever you gain 1 life, your opponent loses 1 life. Whenever your opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life. And so when you play the cards in tandem, the first life point of damage that happens to your opponent is the last life point of damage that has to happen to your opponent. They lose, because it sets off an infinite combo that can't be stopped. And the reason I'm not showing you those versions of this deck is because at least the first few episodes of Deck Deconstructed, I wanted deck combinations that were simpler to show. So mono-themed or monocolor-themed decks for people who don't want the complicated color interactions and having to think about what mana they're going to play along with what cards they're going to play in what orders. So to keep it simple as possible, 1 color, so your land doesn't matter which ones you play as long as it's not something like the Kabiri Plateau or our Radiant Fountain, which you want to save for a little bit later in the game. And it makes it a little bit simpler to understand conceptually when you don't have to mess with the color pie and what colors do what abilities. You can just focus on what does my deck do. And I've had a lot of fun playing this one. I hope you guys will enjoy it and have a lot of fun playing it too. It's one of those decks that's kind of rude though, so be sure for your play group that you let them know ahead of time that you're playing a pretty massive life gain deck. You don't want to tick people off when you tell them you're playing something that's a modern powerhouse. But yeah, so I'm going to get this sleeved and put away, and maybe at some point I will face one of you with this deck. Or maybe our Red Explosion deck from last time, and we'll see just how well it works. Alright, I'll catch you guys next time. Good night.